Jeff Barton, CIO portfolio. Topic is thanks for your time.
Thank you very much. Afternoon, everybody. How are you all feeling? You've had lots and lots of sessions today. Happy? So you might not be happy all the time now. So I'm going to tell a little bit of story that has a little bit of sadness in it, but hopefully there's going to be a kind of good ending to come to. So just to tell you a little bit about myself, my name is Richard Barton. My day job is helping organisations transform the way they work. So using new technology to unlock their data and make things better for their customers, for their staff, and quite a lot of the work I do is in the public sector, so hopefully the things we're doing make things better for the citizens at large. But over the last few years, I've kept coming across a scene which I've tried to kind of do a little cartoon sketch of. And the scene is, if you imagine on the sort of orange figure is a kind of an executive or a senior leader. And they've been kind of looking at some of the architecture artifacts and some of the work that the architects are doing and just going, do you know what, thanks for the hard work, really, thanks, but things have moved on, we can't really use it, okay? So, but thank you for your efforts. And then the architect, who's the blue little cartoon character, is kind of sulking and taking their Sharpies or their pencils away and stalking to the corner. And I keep seeing this quite a lot. There's quite a few of the architects that I work with. Some of them have this reaction of feeling sad at this. Some of them go the other extreme, get angry and frustrated about why their senior leaders aren't paying any attention or listening to what they're offering. So what I wanted to do, just to spend sort of 20 minutes digging into why this might be. I have some theories. I hope you have some theories too. And hopefully offering some ideas about ways we can change things. I don't think they're finished answers yet. I think there's more learning to do, but maybe there's some clues that we can use. So is that the kind of thing you're expecting? Yeah? Cool. So I think part of the root problem of all of this is uncertainty in how much change is going on. So I did the usual thing that you do when you're going to present talks is sort of search around Google and look for images that kind of capture the mood. So I was looking about change and uncertainty, and I came across this. And I don't know about you, but the last few months in the political world has just created enormous amounts of material that you can use for talks about change and uncertainty. I really didn't expect to be seeing this kind of thing in the Twitter and on headline news just a few months ago. Maybe this stuff is quite a bit too removed from your day-to-day work, so we should probably think of something that's a bit close to home. So one of the things architects get to do quite a lot is to do target architecture, so look into the future and start to understand what they're going to need, so whether that's within IT or business terms. So here I am, back in 2012, with my sort of magnifying glass and looking ahead to 2017 to see what I'm going to have included in my architecture. And this is quite hard, so after I've put my architecture together, all sorts of things can happen. So that could be technical components like Docker. I don't think it actually was written in 2012 or if it was someone's idea. But it can go deeper than that, so it can be business models, competitors, threats to your environment. So those things are quite hard to see. Gets even a bit harder than that because even in 2012 there were things that were around, you could have looked and found them, but maybe they didn't have the market share, maybe they weren't credible options, or maybe they, your networks that you're getting all your information from maybe didn't rate them or think they would survive. I could probably have lived without Node.js, but living without Android now. But then it gets even deeper. So there are things that exist that disappear during the time horizon you're looking at. So who else, like me, in 2013, was creating architectures that depended on BlackBerry for their mobile platform? Yeah, a few other hands coming up. I'm sure people keeping their hands down were doing exactly the same. Who was really excited about putting their 3D TV strategy together in 2012? Yeah, come on. Some of you were doing marketing on 3D TV. So that stuff gets really, really hard. But there's even more layers to this change. So, little logo at the bottom. Does anyone know who they are? A couple of nods here. So,
the DNA people.
DNA people, yeah. So 23andMe, they're probably one of the leaders in the market. What they provide a service where you send them part of your body. I think it's now a piece of saliva, but it used to be other stuff. And what they will do is they'll give you a personal DNA sequence. So they've been around for a while. Back in 2007, guess how much your personal DNA sequence would cost you?
£1,000.
Yeah, that's the sort of order of magnitude, yeah? Back in 2007. How about today?
£126, I guess. I just happen to know.
Asking for a friend. So in 10 years, the value for money of that service has gone up by a factor of 10. And it's still accelerating. And there's lots of other stuff that we deal with that has this kind of curve to it. So Moore's Law is a classic example. I was doing a bit of digging. The value for money for solar panels has gone up 20-fold in 10 years. And the value for money for sort of mobile phone services, data services, has gone up by about 25 in 10 years. You can keep finding these examples around the place. So here's something that we know exists, we know it's stable and reliable business, but if you're making calculations in your target architecture to say what's worth trading off against another solution, give it 2 years and your choices have all been spoiled by this accelerating improvement. So we've got a really, really tough job to do. Has anybody solved this? Well, I think they have. So if we look at things like product development, so when I was starting out on my career, the typical shape and size of a project would be, it's the classic waterfall. You're doing gathering requirements, doing analysis, Gantt charts appearing that take place over a number of years. That's kind of normal. Nowadays, already, lots of organisations are working at a much, much faster pace. So recently I've been working with some of the bits of the public sector. Public sector's got a reputation for being slow and backwards. There are more than one team around that could take an idea from initial conversation to a live service in front of citizens within about 9 to 12 weeks. So a few sprints. Right? And that's arguably the best bits of the public sector that is even being done in the public sector. And then when you look at the kind of unicorn organisations like the Amazons and the Netflixes and people like that, they are just moving so incredibly fast. It's just unbelievable. I've been fortunate enough last few weekends of joining in some hackathons that are communities of people coming together to help solve problems. One example. A police officer came in and shared a problem that they had to do with dealing with homelessness. A team formed around them, did user researching, did prototyping, did coding and building, and within 4 hours the police officer had an app on their phone that was helping them solve their problem. Just mind-blowingly fast. And I think that's the first sort of takeaway here. Fast iterations with users wins. So I know, I've even heard on some of the other talks today, people kind of going, well, it's all right for some things and you can't really develop requirements from sort of user journeys and things like that. I'm not quite so sure about this. Maybe you won't get perfect answers fast the first time, but more organisations more often are getting better results by using these techniques and working this way. So, what does that mean for architects? Well, the thing is, this is probably where those awkward conversations with the stakeholders come in. Because while they're getting these consistent results, and then the architects are kind of running along afterwards going, oh, hang on, I've got my target architecture here. You know, things are just moving on, the business is just moving on. And what the architects are doing kind of becomes a bit like science fiction. It's just sort of paper that's, it might be an interesting read, but it's not affecting the real world. Just out of interest, I've got this planet and this star on this chart. Does anyone know what they are? Does anyone come across those? So I've nicked these off a guy called Adrian Cockcroft. So he used to be CTO of Netflix and now is with Amazon and things like that. This blue splotch is the internal architecture, is the kind of the wiring diagram for Netflix. And the other one is the kind of the wiring diagram for Twitter. These things just are built in such a completely different way. There's no real point trying to apply some other traditional architecture tools to them. They just don't respond to that kind of analysis. So, what are we going to do? Well, these techniques, fast iterations with users wins, but there's a few bumps along the way. So I've picked out a few of these, and maybe these are some things that we can think about trying to tackle. So the first thing, here's a chart. Imagine this is a graph looking at a feature that's being developed with these really fast iterative approaches. So across the bottom are the number of iterations which go up, and gradually over time the feature's getting better and better and better, getting better performance. A thing that happens quite often is at some point during this process there's a break in the flow. Classic example that comes up in a lot of public sector work is an organisation finds a paper form and starts doing this rapid iteration process to try and automate it and improve it. And they get better, and they get better, and it's a slicker and slicker process. And then partway through they realise if they re-engineered the process, you wouldn't actually need a form in the first place. Now they pivot and they recover and they get back on track. But it would be nice to try and head off or avoid some of those disconnections. So that's possibly one area to look at. Another area is iterating fast with your users relies on you knowing who your users are, and they're not always people that are easy to get a handle on. So some of them are, working against you. Some of them are actually deliberately trying to damage your service. Some of them might be legitimately doing that because they're your competitors or they're new entrants to the market. And sometimes agile teams working in agile ways, focusing on their primary users, can sometimes miss these other characters. So that might be something we can help with. The next one is try this kind of imagining a picture here of sort of shared infrastructure. So we've all just been swapping cables on our PCs and things like that, and with a few exceptions, you can basically find power, find displays, and get things to work. That requires on building that kind of common and shared infrastructure and standards. Iterative teams working in a very agile way find that quite hard. What they end up creating is kind of unique plugs with just the right number of pins for their particular purpose. So it then gets very hard to plug things together. So that might be something we can help with. I guess the final one that I've decided to pick out, it's not only these four, but just four things to think about, is there's a lot of what we work on that you can't kind of create and delete at the push of a button. So some of that might be big bits of physical infrastructure, fixed assets, buildings, that kind of thing. The other important thing is some of the softer stuff. So, you can't create and delete a relationship or trust with just the push of a button. If you iterate and get that wrong, you can't just kind of create it like you do a piece of software. And that's something that the agile teams sometimes struggle with. So we've got four things there that these new fast approaches don't handle very well. But please don't forget that the approach still wins. You can't use these things as excuses to try and resist these new ways of working, because they will still win. They'll recover and learn the lessons and get a new version out 4 times quicker before you've caught up. So we might need to look at this in a slightly different way. So I don't think we've got all the answers. Maybe collection across all the rooms that are talking at the moment, we might have a good, we're starting to get a few proportions of them. But what I thought I'd share is some tactics that I've been using with some of the organisations I'm working with, and so far I think I'm kind of getting results. I can't prove it, I haven't got all the data, but they seem to be heading in the right direction. So first thing is focus. So I'm working with some architects who are really interested in kind of looking at the entire area of a solution and covering it, everything in meticulous detail. And Philip sort of talked around along these sorts of lines a little bit earlier, and I'm sure it's going to crop up again in a minute. There is no way that you can cover all of the responsible areas of an architect at this sort of pace and do everything well. So what's going to be required is focusing on particular areas. Yes, you might need to get into a piece of detail, but you need to choose when you're doing that and have good justification on it. And the justifications might not be the things that you're interested in, it might be the things that the teams need. A good area that I always look at is what's blocking these fast teams, what's getting in the way, and they are areas that are probably that need some attention. Another area is to think about choosing what to focus on. Currently, a lot of the architects that I work with are kind of focused on solutions. Now, it doesn't have to be IT, but the things that solving the problem. So what are the components that you add together and get working together to solve the problem? It's quite hard to do this in these fast, agile environments because these are the areas that are iterating and changing at this incredible pace. So by the time you've drawn the picture, the team's moved on and done something else. Or they've created two versions, tested both of them, and they've got evidence to know which is the best answer. They're not really looking for architecture help so much in these areas. A better place to look possibly is the architecture of the problem. So as an example I've got here, I've got some participants, some actors. They might be someone coaching somebody and a benefit recipient. They could be a job seeker and someone providing jobs, or they could be your customer and their service agent. So participants, and then they have behaviours and motivations and personal skills, and through that they interact on something and you end up getting the outcome they're looking for. It might look different to the sorts of things that architectures normally apply to, but actually a lot of the tools are very portable into this sort of world. It's a different kind of language, but it uses a lot of the same sort of techniques. Part of the reason for thinking this way is so far I'm finding that the problems are more durable, longer lasting than the solutions are. So if you're investing your time in these areas to help people understand what the architecture of the problem is, you're finding interesting and useful things that have got a longer shelf life than sometimes on the solution. Another tool that I keep finding keeps coming up as being useful. Different methods have different language for this. So sort of MODAF, this would be sort of operating nodes. Some people call this business capabilities, but it's the combination of the IT and the people and the ways of working all together. If you're into the service world, you can think of service as being a wrapper around these capabilities. What I'm finding, if you're using these sorts of things as your currency for your architecture, the units and components of your architecture, then again you're producing interesting answers that are more durable than just looking at the things like the IT on their own. And then final thing to think about is back to this relationship between the stakeholders and the architects themselves, us in this room. Fast iteration with users we know is winning for sort of in the product and software development space. So why don't we kind of apply it and see if it wins in the architecture space? So I'm starting to try this and experiment with this. So far it seems to be quite useful. I think one of the reasons it's quite useful is, and again, Philip's picked up some of these points already, the paper that we produce and the architecture and the diagrams is kind of only a means to an end. The architecture actually works when it's in someone's head and they're making decisions with it and setting their course with it. So lots of the techniques that these fast agile teams use, we can use in our work. There are things like buzzwords that are around, like working out loud, showing very early rough sketches of things to your stakeholders and to your users way before you think they are ready. It's quite nerve-wracking when you start to do it, but actually it kind of really starts binding the team together. Part of the reason I've used sketches and little cartoons here is I'm finding if I present something that's too polished, my stakeholders start critiquing it.
Yes.
If I take the same intellectual content and its scrappy edges and the corners don't kind of join up, they start working with me on it. I'm not good enough on the philosophy and human nature of this to understand, but it seems to work. Similarly, things like hackathons. So there's coding teams that do this kind of thing. Sometimes they do them for good causes. Hands up if you've been to a hackathon. Yeah, so a few people. If you haven't, find an excuse to get along to one. Doesn't matter what the topic is, doesn't matter if you think you're going to contribute to it. Just go and see how these people work. It might blow your mind. It's really impressive how teams of passionate people can produce really great stuff quite quickly. I started taking some of this stuff back into my work, even in the public sector. So having a hack day, and instead of having 20 people sitting around a boardroom having a discussion, we go, right, get up out of your chairs. When we leave this room, we're going to leave with the product. We're going to leave with the architecture product. We might have photographed some post-it notes on a wall. It might be a handwritten sketch that we've stuck through a photocopy. But we're going to leave the room with the product. The teams can work with those things, even though I might be quite uncomfortable with the sort of the quality of it. So all of these are things to try. And I think the final thing is back to fast iterations with users wins. I think if you don't take anything else away, this is working. I think it's worth us trying that in our work and seeing how far we can take it. And that's all I had, unless you have some questions.
Got a question. From your experience, is there any, I use the word boundaries that from an architecture point of view that you may want to put into place to kind of steer this approach?
I'm not sure what you mean by boundaries, like areas you can't go and get involved in.
Areas. So I'm just thinking, if you go back to your plug example, where people may find weird and wonderful ways to plug it all together, do you find you need to be saying, well, actually, I don't know, here's 3 different database technologies you want to use, or if you design a user interface, it needs to conform to these standards. So those kind of boundaries.
So I think it depends. So if you're talking about database technologies, I would say, do you need to put constraints around those things? If these teams are iterating and demonstrating these things are working really, really quickly, maybe you might have been used to putting boundaries in those areas, but you don't need them anymore. I would be thinking more of looking at boundaries and constraints around the problem space. So things like people in this marketplace need to share information. So how's that information going to be shared? Not necessarily do they both need to have the same technologies underpinning that. Does that make sense?
It does. I suppose just thinking about, we always talk about simplicity, look for simplicity. I suppose I'm just interested in if you give somebody a bit more of a constraint, are they actually more creative, I suppose?
Yeah, I guess what I think we're learning is, where do you apply the constraints?
Yeah.
And maybe the constraints are at the edges, so the plug and the socket works the same, rather than the internals.
Yeah.
They've used different components inside their machine. But I think that's some of the things that we traditionally try and constrain around the solution, and maybe we don't need to, and we can see how the teams iterate. And then I think it's focusing, picking out the dangerous areas where teams have got to join up and helping them find ways. Again, finding single answers to things maybe not be necessary if you can limit it to one or two, and be prepared to iterate. Put a standard and be prepared to change it. We've even been doing some of this work around, say, policy and legislation. So, normally you take the view that you can't change this stuff. Well, actually, if the policy or the legislation is not working, it might not be able to change very quickly, but why not start that process to change it?
If you are part of the team of fast regulation, have you ever perceived a gap between the talents of the generation of doing it faster and generation of having the wider context, and how do you deal with that?
So, I might be reading too much into your words, but the first thing I'd say is I wouldn't use the word generation.
Fine.
Just because some of the stereotypes about the youngsters do it fast and the old ones don't doesn't apply. In terms of skills, I think I'm not sure it's so much of skills. It's about forming teams. So if you really form teams well, they become a new organism, and they get on and they work with each other's strengths, and they stop working to their set boundaries and roles. They just get on a team and get a job done. So I think it's more about getting these groups of people to develop into real teams, and that might mean as an architect, sometimes you're writing code or drawing some front-end work or doing some communication, because that's what the team needs you to do to get the job done. You might have arrived in the team through your architecture skills, but if the team matures and really gets motoring, sometimes you're running off and getting the pizza. It's, the team takes over from the individuals. Is there a question?
Interested in your view about high availability insurance, specifically in agile teams, because my previous experience has been agile teams can create a nest, and you showed the Netflix piece, which suppose if Netflix goes offline for an hour or two in a location, people get upset, but it doesn't kill anyone. So I'm kind of interested about, traditionally I've seen us use an architecture as a framework to give the agile teams to work within, and say actually these are your boundaries, but go for it in between. Just kind of wondering your views on that.
So there are some organisations that have got some really high constraints. So you can go onto GitHub now, which is a sort of code repository, and you can see code that has been written and published by GCHQ. So they're using open source, they're using agile teams, they're using experimentation. And partly the reason they're doing that, and there's some research, I've not quoted here, but you can kind of Google around and find it, is that doing things slowly and deliberately and carefully doesn't always produce the results that people expect. So part of the reason Netflix do that, Netflix are famous for this thing called Chaos Monkey. So the way they make their systems highly reliable is they keep breaking them, and they change them. They release so fast that they're very good at releasing, and they don't make many mistakes when they release, and they can roll back in seconds if they do. So I think we're still learning how to do this. So then, the National Cyber Security Council are kind of changing their views on passwords. They're changing their guidance to go for user need first, and then security being good. So I think this is a right area where some of the assumptions we had from the old ways we used to do things maybe don't apply. But still, it comes back to fast iterations with user wins. If you can get these things out and used in a manageable way, you can best way to find out if they're robust enough is to expose them to being attacked. That's how much the vulnerabilities are discovered. So I think there's a lot in here where it's breaking our assumptions about you can't do fast and good quality, you can't do fast and secure. Actually, I was right there a few years ago. I'm seeing what some of these teams are doing, and it's kind of changing my assumptions.